Dear colleagues, yes, I think we are going to begin this session. Well, we were extremely pleased when Marc Flandreau accepted to be our first keynote speaker today. So I'm going to present him. Marc Flandreau is a former graduate student from the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He received his PhD in economics at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris in 1993. And after a brief stay as a professor in Lille University, around 2001, he held the chair of International Finance at Sciences Po Paris from 2003 to 2008. Then, and until 2017, he became professor of international economics and international history at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. He has been a visitor of many universities, including Berkeley, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, Keio University, and Toda University in Japan. He is currently Howard Marks Professor of Economics History at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also a member of the Bank of International Settlements Policy Panel and a senior advisor at the BIS Historical Data Project. His latest book, Anthropologist and the Stock Exchange, published in 2016, casts new lights on the unholy trinity of scientific knowledge, power, and finance in Victorian Britain by tracing previously unseen linkages between scientific societies, financial ventures, and imperial interests. The book demonstrates in very precise ways how scientific truth is really part of the value system of financial capitalism. So these first keynote lectures will bear on frauds, computers, and rational expectations, the London Stock Exchange and the rise of financial economics in the 19th century. Dear Marc Flandreau, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Govan, for the invitation first and for the introduction. I'm delighted to be back, not exactly here because this used to be the Institut d'Études Politiques Lille used to be located a little further when I was teaching there. But still, it's a very nice opportunity for me to be here today. What I'm going to tell you about is a set of reflections from an ongoing research project, which is unfolding some ideas that actually I have started articulating in the book you were mentioning on the connection between anthropology, British anthropology, and the London Stock Exchange. And one key theme of the presentation, the lecture I'm going to give, is the idea that certain institutions, in particular the London Stock Exchange, actually play a very important and unrecognized role in shaping economic ideas, and in fact beyond economic ideas, shaping the history of ideas. And the contribution I'm trying to make is to try and show how this happens. So what are the connections between the institutions of capitalism and the ideas of capitalism, if you will. So this appears very general, to say vague, but hopefully what I would like to do is get into some potentially useful, I hope, ways to articulate these various things. On the one hand, the institutions of capitalism, and on the other, the ideas of capitalism. So my starting point was the challenge I was given. There's a theme for this conference: money, banks, and finance in economic thought. And I don't define myself as a historian of economic ideas. I read with great interest the work of historians of economic ideas, but that's not what I principally produce, or at least that's not how I think of it. But definitely, and that's the reason for reading with great interest the works of a historian of thought, my work on the history of the economy takes me on and on in contact with thinkers, great and not so great, who grapple with let's say, real-life situations, with actual institutions, with places where they appear in ways that very often are quite different from the way in which they are typically encountered by historians of thought. You guys, so to speak, you tend to work by identifying great thinkers as a corpus of their production, and then based on that corpus, you construct elaboration to make sense of their writing. And as a historian of facts, I encounter the same characters, but sometimes grappling with weird situations. And there is a question of what to do with that. And my talk is a way to tell you that there's a lot to do with that, that there's a lot beyond the corpus of the great author, and that the archive actually is a place where we can get a lot of additional insight on the topic. So let me begin with a diagonal way. In fact, it's not really diagonal. Somehow it's spot on, but you won't see it until the end of the talk, hopefully. And that's the case of David Ricardo. I think David Ricardo is a very good example that his prominence in the history of ideas is of course, well recognized. And as we all know, he was a broker in the London Stock Exchange. And so he was a broker, and he was an economist, and he was both. And there are questions of how we can problematize the relation between his practice as a broker and his ideas as an economist. And of course, there are ways, and people have been working along those lines. There are very legitimate ways to think of the connection between the two. For instance, you can think of how his trading strategies shaped his economic views, or vice versa. If you think of the Bullion Report, it's about, exchange rates and government bond prices, and that's a story articulated by a broker. So obviously, there are clear connection. And Ricardo was taking positions on the market for himself and for his customers, and so of course there's an obvious story there. It can even go further, because if you think along those lines, Ricardo was also an insider of a process that also involved such things as knowledge on bullion flows, for instance. If you try to unpack information on the sort of data that Ricardo could use, or that he could use to shape his ideas, you'll go to a number of specific bullion brokers who were themselves connected to the London Stock Exchange, connected to Ricardo, and obviously the fact that he had that kind of connection suggests that there were conversations, there were reflections that were involving this data and this form of knowledge, which sort of was informed by his position in the stock exchange. At the same time, and I can't remember, I was trying to locate that letter, but you'll have to take my word. There's a very amusing letter in Ricardo's correspondence where someone approaches him and says, "Oh, this is so exciting. You're such an exciting character. It looks like in the stock exchange you have lots of people who think, about economics and political economy, and I'd like to meet with some of those brokers." And because, your views obviously are very important. And Ricardo says, "Well, in fact, I'm sort of a little bit alone, I can introduce you to a couple of people, sure, but it's not like we all discuss political economy." Now, that doesn't close the matter, to me at least, because there are ways in which Ricardo is very unique in more than one way. And so, for instance, when you look at the archive of the Stock Exchange, and here I discuss the archive of the Stock Exchange Committee, you see suddenly Mr. Ricardo who intervenes, and you can, it's sort of course, when you have a discussion among a number of members of the Stock Exchange and David Ricardo speaks, you are kind of under the spell. And he says, "Well, I disagree," and these are pretty poor archives, so it's difficult to make sense directly of what's happening. So he says, "You disagree," but you're like, "Oh, Ricardo disagrees." That's really exciting, although you're not exactly sure of what's happening. But one thing that we do know was that he was a politician, so to speak, of the London Stock Exchange. The London Stock Exchange had a government of its own, and he was one of the men who made the London Stock Exchange in the early 19th century, in the shape where it would be more familiar later, like the great London Stock Exchange of the 19th century was made by people like Ricardo. And that takes me to where I'm trying to go. There's another way where the significance of someone like Ricardo is not a statistical significance. The importance, it's not a question of how many political economists were in the stock exchange. The stock exchange and thinking in terms of the market and how the market operates can inform us in different ways than just the question of trying to think either in terms of the relation between trading and thinking, or again, was the London Stock Exchange a cluster of economists? Markets have specific logics, specific ways of operating, and the people who make markets, and Ricardo was one of them, as a result, are shape the institutions in a way that are worth pondering, and this is where I'm trying to go. So what I'm trying to articulate is what I suggest to call the stock exchange modality. And what is the stock exchange modality? Well, the stock exchange modality is something which I think has been underestimated to understand the 19th century, the history of the 19th century. It is the contribution that the London capital market made to forms of knowing and forms of understanding that were shaped during that century. I don't think that anyone has actually realized how important the stock exchange was to structure ways, again, of knowing, of understanding, ways of colonizing that were developed during that century. And what I'm trying to do in my current research, actually, is to try and ponder the importance of that very curious institution in that very fascinating century, the 19th century. And that takes us again to the importance of people like Ricardo, because as an architect of this very curious institution, there's an echo between what he does and what that century is. Now, in some previous work I have done, and there was the allusion to my recent book, what I've been doing is sort of trying to make that point by somehow going as far as I could from the London Stock Exchange. And the point I made was to say, well, actually, if you look at the evolution of British anthropology in the 19th century, especially at some critical moment when it got organized in literally its current shape, when the modern institution of British anthropology were born, you find that actually the London Stock Exchange played a very important role. There was an overlap between people who tried to reorganize the functioning of British anthropology and people who were at that time inside the London Stock Exchange playing the role that is known today as vulture funds. Okay, so people who were vulturing defaulted government debts and trying to develop all kinds of institutions and mechanisms to deal with these debts. And guess what? These people were also reorganizing British anthropology at that point. I tried to make sense of that, and part of the argument I was giving was to say, well, in fact, in the work of anthropologists, there is a function of brokerage. Anthropologists, back in those years, British anthropologists were translators. And they played a very important role in helping to acclimatize new government debt products, which were floated in the London Stock Exchange. When you were floating in London the securities of a foreign government, since a lot of those securities were tied to colonization process and they were in exotic places, it was very important to have a story about the people who inhabited these countries. So since you knew that some of those debts would be defaulted, since you knew that later on you would ask for debt for land swaps, you would want to know who would be your neighbor when you would start your colonization process. And this is how anthropology suddenly become tremendously important. And they are concerned with constructing their truth, their anthropological truths that have to do with what man is, I guess, At the same time, when they were also invested in the stock exchange process, because the stock exchange was invested in this definition of humanity as it was taking place at that point. Now, if that's true for anthropology, what about economics, right? It has to be maturing in ways that are perhaps so evident that they may blind us. So now, what I'm going to try and develop today is a variant of that idea that focuses on one specific dimension, which is the role of calculations and the rise of financial economics. We know, for instance, that such things as option theory started developing in the 1870s. What I'm going to try and show is that actually the sort of hotbed where this process took place takes us back to the logic of functioning of the London Stock Exchange and takes us back to the importance of the need of the market to acclimatize a number of new instruments. The important idea that is at the heart of that is to emphasize that actually the calculating functionality, which is a form of the stock exchange modality, the calculating functionality is a tool that helps people to resolve information asymmetries. So what I'm trying to say is that to have a market that operates well, you need to be able to tell people, yeah, we do calculations and we do them right. We know how to do calculation. There's a safe way to calculate such things as the yield on a government bond, for instance, or the yield on a railway bond. Now, as you do that, of course, you stumble on many problems because as this process is taking place, you also have financial innovation, and the products that are floated back in those years are not straightforward. Now, of course, in order for those products to be successful in the market, you need to have a story to tell to people where it is actually, where they become actually straightforward. If a financial product is not understood by the market, it's going to be just understood by a few specialist traders, it won't be very liquid, it won't sell so well, so you have a narrow market, it's not going to work well. Okay? So you have a process of acclimatization, liquidity provision, and so on and so forth, which calls into the machinery the production of economic ideas and the articulation of economic ideas. And so the argument that I'm trying to make is that certain important aspects of financial economics that are developed in the 1870s, again, this is the root, this is the beginning of the process where the Black and Scholes formula is the last stage of the evolution, are going to sort of be worked out and be elaborated upon again, as a manner to keep the market functioning. So ideas will result from the need to resolve information asymmetries. And the key ideas that will have to be clarified are actually ideas that pertain to calculations, and therefore calculators become intermediaries. If you will, almost the same way anthropologists were intermediaries of sort, right? Calculators are intermediaries of sort. Okay? And that's the process which takes place at that moment. Now, one curious feature which caught my attention and which is the reason why I decided to deepen that specific line of investigation was the fact that as they do that, you see suddenly a group of financial economists essentially articulating an early version of the rational expectation hypothesis. And what intrigued me was the condition that had led to the production of that concept. Now, there would be a more traditional way of history of thought to go about that and try to think of what could be the predecessors of that form. But what I'm going to try and do, and that's kind of the self-assigned task, is to try to show you how the market produced that norm, how the rational expectation concept becomes the solution to a set of problems, dilemmas, difficulty that the London Stock Exchange is experiencing at that specific moment in time. Okay, so it's a sort of attempt at telling the story just from a market point of view and seeing how far I can go. So now, in order to motivate the investigation, and in effect, I will more or less follow the process of discovery that I myself followed as I went from one lead to the next. hopefully making the quest a little bit more exciting. This is Victorian Britain, so so that gives you the title for this part of the presentation. It's the curious case of the Investor's Monthly Manual. The Investor Monthly Manual, some of you are familiar with it. There was an Investor's magazine that had been launched in the early 1860s by The Economist, so under Bagehot. It was a companion publication that was informing investors on the specific techniques and detail of the various products. So if you want to get precise financial information about different instruments and essentially all the instruments that were listed in the London Stock Exchange, that was the source you would use. And one question that was in the background, I guess, for people at the time, of course, was, okay, I buy such or such instrument, what's going to be my return? So they wanted to know that. And initially, the Investor's Monthly Manual doesn't really engage with that. They just give them a table. And in that table, you can read a sort of formula for equivalence. So they give you, if you have a certain coupon or dividend for that bond and you have a certain price, then you can compare it as an equivalent for another bond that would have a different coupon but also a different price. And that sort of enables you to make comparison among instruments that may be different in the way they've been constructed and as a result difficult to compare, but which would be as a result reconciled. Now, this table is a bizarre table because, essentially they're to calculate those yields, they just divide the dividend or the coupon by the price. So it's a kind of measure of the short-term interest rate. Although most of those instruments are very long-term instruments, so it doesn't really make sense. And they know it, but it seemed that it was a kind of crude norm that they were giving themselves. Now, 1879, this sort of companion table is dropped, and the IMM produced a new type of information which is tabulated, and where they say, oh, okay, we're going to be able now to give you more detail. And they say, well, it's going to be very crude. Again, there are lots of caveats that they give. And what they do is that they take the latest price and the latest two dividends that a certain security has paid, and again, they divide one by the other, okay? And they say, well, many things are happening around, so we give you this number, but you should be careful. But still, we give you this number. Now, what is happening is that no sooner they put that new service out that they crumble under hostile mail. So they have all those readers from everywhere in Britain saying, what are those numbers? I don't understand. My brokers for that such and such instrument tells me this. My advisors tell me this. And they literally cannot, address so much things. So initially they sort of push back saying, well, but doing computation in a really rigorous way, that's difficult, that's a lot of work. But the thing keeps pushing, and eventually they will change. Now, what was frustrating the readers? So there are two things that come out in the conversation. They both are variants of the so-called redemption feature that the securities have. So these financial instruments are reimbursed at some point, and they can be reimbursed in various ways. So one way to reimburse them is the so-called conversion option. So essentially, for instance, if it's a government bond, the government can decide to pay you back, okay? So it's essentially an option. That's in this type of product. And that's one reason why at that point you start having these works on option theory, because they need to address that problem. But there's another feature that seems to infuriate people even more, because they featured for more products and products that apparently concern more investors, and that was the way lotteries, amortization via lotteries, were being dealt with. Now, how were those lotteries operating? Well, you can see a wheel, so they were just like lotteries, and you would have, for every single bond, you would have a little metallic piece put in the drum, and then at every year or twice yearly, there would be a drawing of, say, 1/10 of the outstanding bond. And then, if your number is being drawn, you're being paid back. Okay, so you see your money coming back, right? And that's the way whereby an outstanding bond is gradually amortized. You can see, for instance, this in this drum, there are almost no little things left at the end because basically that bond was at the end of its reimbursement story. Now, why is this thing a problem? It's a problem because suppose that you have a bond, say, that has a nominal value of 100, and it's trading in the market, say, at 70. If you're drawn, you're going to make a gain of 30. So it's a huge gain, right? It's a big, big gain that you're making. And then there's the coupon as well that you're going to get. Now, it's also possible that in the future, you're only reimbursed, say, if it's a 40-year bond, it's only after 40 years. And what will be the price of the bond at that time, you don't necessarily know, et cetera, et cetera. So you're contemplating possibly an enormous short-term gain with a certain probability, but you need to be able to price that. Okay? And so what the IMM does, eventually, January 1883, they switch to a new method and they say, okay, now we give you the yield to the investor at latest price, redemption included. And then from that date on, they will give this number which they claim corrects for that infamous problem of the redemption risk that would not have been properly priced by any other method. Okay? Now, the question that I have is why does the whole thing take that sort of strange shape, you know, where initially they don't want to really engage with the problem of measurement, and then they have this method which they say is crude and it makes everybody very upset, and eventually they suggest a method to handle this. And again, as I've mentioned earlier, the problem is that with this kind of instrument, you were going to have a yield that was going to be dependent upon the fact that you would be drawn early or late. Okay, that would be the critical thing. And the difficulty that they had was, how am I supposed to handle that? Okay, how am I supposed to summarize that into a number, just one figure? And the preferred answer, and we have proof, we have evidence, I'll show you in a second of that, is that as a result, people did a little bit like Allais with his lotteries. They preferred to give their customers, if they were financial advisors or brokers, they would give people a menu. They would say, okay, these are the probabilities, and these are the payoffs, right? And I give you a table. Now, maybe you're someone who really value the benefit of an early drawing, so you're a risk taker, right, and so on. Or maybe you're not, and so, but that's for you. I'm not distilling all this information in just one yield number. I'm giving you all the yield and all the probability, and that's for you to figure and make your choice. Okay? And so that's an example that I'm. So you want to only look at annual rate percent. I mean, there's a variant of that where they do half yearly. And N is the period during which an hypothetical bond is being reimbursed. So this is a very long one. This one at 99 years. And as you can see, if you reimburse very early, you make this big gain, okay? But if you reimburse much later, you make a much smaller gain, okay? And that's the way they're going to talk to their customer. They're going to say, okay, this is the information that you need to have, right? Now, suddenly, in the mid-1870s, in the midst of a meeting of a learned society, the Institute of Actuaries in London, there's a push taking place where they say, no, that doesn't work. We're going to provide one number, okay? And the number that they provide essentially comes from a simple idea. They just assume risk neutrality, okay? So they just say, okay, let's take the mathematical expectation of these random drawings, and then we can do the math, and we can come up with one number, because this number will be essentially the rational expectation of the present value of your investment. Okay. Now this is done by a guy. His name is William Sutton. He's a big, powerful person in this institute, And the title of the paper, you'll see why it matters soon, is on the rate of interest yielded by foreign government loans. And what it does is that it goes on to computing all this government loans performance, and it shows you exactly doing the computation using, again, rational expectation. It gives you the various numbers, and it applies this formula across the board and gives tables and so on and so forth. Now, he gives the mathematical proof, but he also gives an intuition, which is actually very important to understand the story. He says, oh, actually, suppose that we take the point of view of an insurance company that has to price a contingent claim. Wouldn't we be using the mathematical expectation? Yes, that's what insurance companies do. They operate on big numbers. Essentially, the law of large numbers applies to them. So, you know, that's the logic that we should be applying. Now, of course, it's interesting because suddenly you sort of shift, right, from the idea of what do we do as insurance companies to this is how you measure those things. Huh? And we can see how the rational expectation idea is acclimatized. For an insurance company, it's logical, right? The insurance company is not going to have a risk aversion. I mean, it can price a risk aversion, but the idea is just, you know, the chances. Pure doctrine of chances, and so you make your computation using exactly the same logic as if you were an insurance company, okay? And so what Sutton does, and he's at the Institute of Actuaries, and the people sitting around the table are all actuaries, and so they're very familiar with that logic. So there are a couple who grumble and say, yeah, but you know, I have some of my customers, and they really like that I give them more numbers and things like that. But essentially, it pushes this thing through, and they're all like, "Yeah, makes sense. Let's move to this new norm." I'll develop that in a little bit later. But this is actually what is informing what happened to the IMM very soon later, because what is happening is that the Institute of Actuaries is spreading its gospel at that moment, and in fact, it has a handbook, and in its handbook, it trains people to do that kind of computation. And the first edition of the handbook is literally a couple of months before the IMM changes its norm, right? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that what is happening when the IMM gets attacked for, you know, not using proper methods, and then when eventually it changes, is that it acknowledges the power, the scientific power of the Institute of Actuaries as a norm setter. The Institute of Actuaries is able to implement that norm, which then becomes what you're supposed to do if you're not incompetent. And so the IMM, which is just, you know, just a journal, has to go by these rules. Now, we still don't understand why. Why did Mr. Sutton in 1875 get so hot on the question of producing just one number? And to understand why, well, we need to talk a little bit about frauds, scandals, and knowledge monopolies. When the new theorem and the rational expectation criterion is being applied by Sutton, what is happening in the background is a parliamentary investigation, the so-called Select Committee on Loans to Foreign States, which in the aftermath of a big meltdown, meltdown, parliamentary investigation, that's the normal sequence, finds that, of course, what do you do when you do that? You find that the underwriters and the financiers did all kind of horrible things. And the main charge is that the financier and the underwriters had, had manipulated prices and information. And as a result of this manipulation of prices and information, they had misled the public in investment that the public didn't read as risky as they were. And special focus goes on a loan to Honduras. So this loan had been issued at 80 initially. It had a large coupon, but you would be making a big gain if you were reimbursed immediately. And no sooner than this loan was issued, that the contractor started announcing, and we'll do extra drawing for this Honduras loan, etc. And so they allegedly create a lot of excitement in the market for a lottery, the lottery feature of the bond. So it's essentially a technique of baiting, and accusations were leveled against the contractors, the underwriters, for having done that. Now, what Sutton does at that moment is sort of nourishing this case, and he proposed two computations. He says, first computation, let's do what the IMM will be wrongly doing, right? That is, let's focus on a pricing that forgets that there is a benefit from being drawn, okay? The incorrect method. And let's apply my correct method. What do we see? Well, we see in the case of Honduras, we see that, and the difference appears a little trifling, but you're discussing, you know, gentlemen in London in Victorian era, so 2.5% can get them really excited. The yield was 12.5% according to the incorrect calculation, but 15% according to Sutton's rigorous calculus. So in other words, with the correct method, you have a much higher yield, which means that the method detects risky bonds. That's the claim that they make. So they say, we have a method that's going to be a gatekeeper for investors because it's going to tell you that there are risks out there, okay? So it's extremely important, therefore, that people pay attention to our method because otherwise they won't be warned properly of the risks that are involved. Okay? And his conclusion is that had investors been able to figure the extravagant terms offered in some cases, this would have acted as a caution, and instead of serving as a bait, would have had the contrary effect. So therefore, they must produce just one number and not this all kind of complicated things, because you need to deliver to the investor a simple message that is a warning message. Okay? Now, that might have been true or not true, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that suddenly what you have is that because you have this powerful institution, the Institute of Actuaries, that is there, suddenly they are able to implement to the market, to enforce on the market a norm which has the quality of a monopoly behavior. Okay? So I have like 3 minutes? Yes. Okay. So I skip a little bit. You're missing some fun. But that's essentially there was a refinement to the story. You'll read it. Now, where does that take me? In fact, that takes me to my starting point, and that's summarized here: knowledge, a supply side story. What I'm trying to say here is that, and that's a way to inform directly the way we write this tree of ideas. I think that we should spend more time thinking of the supply side of ideas as opposed to the demand side. And what I mean by that is literally thinking in terms of market structures. So, for instance, in the case that I've been telling, what do we see? We see a monopoly institution, okay, the Institute of Actuaries, which meets with a security problem, which is a typical capitalist problem, right? Financial intermediation, breeds information asymmetries. How do you resolve those information asymmetries? You need to develop credible method that resolve those information asymmetries. The emergence of a market norm does exactly that. Okay? So as a result, there is something in that story that shows us the connection between forms of monopoly knowledge. The Institute of Actuaries has the monopoly of credible financial calculation, and the ability as a result to start with financial innovation, essentially, right? Because here we are dealing with a certain way of pricing an instrument that is going to make it more transparent, that is going to make it more liquid, that is going to make it more marketable, and so on and so forth. So these improvements of the measurement technique are part of the capitalist machine. They are part of the mechanism whereby markets operate. Okay? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that we can, and I've just done, I hope, produce a history of economic knowledge that uses such tools as the tools of industrial economics. So essentially, thinking of whether a certain set of ideas is produced in a competitive or monopolistic way is very important to understand the nature of the ideas that we are looking at. So thinking of it in a sort of along the same line, and thinking of the importance of the stock exchange in that whole story, because who is the deus ex machina of this whole thing? The stock exchange. the need to resolve information asymmetries in the market, which requires you to be able to price. And then you need to find a way to construct a theory that enables you to price. Okay, so this is the stock exchange that's pushing all the way, which then leads us to the conclusion that that the stock exchange plays a very important role in the progresses of science, and we should or could at least speak as a result of capitalist knowledge. The nature of economic ideas are shaped by the accumulation regime, if you will, in which we find ourselves. So the message here is not just that we should look at the economic context as context. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there's no such thing as a context to some extent, right? What I'm trying to say is that even the world of capitalism, the instrument that we're dealing with, the computation, etc., is entirely generated by the machine. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that, well, you could be doing history of ideas or you could be doing history of facts, and maybe it's exactly the same thing, in fact. I'm just trying to take a different road to do the same thing as what you do. Now, one further conclusion of that, and which may be an uncomfortable one, is that ideas and monopoly have something in common, right? In this case, specifically, the monopoly of the Institute of Actuaries, very important in pushing this concept of rational expectations. Okay? There are modern, parallels, I'm sure they come to your mind. I mean, the prestige of a university, Chicago or else, is going to play a very important role in enforcing a certain norm. It's the same mechanism, exactly the same mechanism as the Institute of Actuaries. Now, going further in this direction, what is in the background of many of the discussion that we have is that, what does it take to be an economist, and even better, a prestigious one at that? Because that's the thing. The Institute of Actuaries was prestigious. And so again, think of Ricardo. The prestige of Ricardo, does it exist independently of his role as a very successful broker who's the main broker for the British debt? Can we believe that 1 second? So in fact, I've just told you the story of David Ricardo. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for this really fascinating talk. I'm sure there will be a lot of reactions from the floor. So the microphone is going to circulate among you. Who wants to begin? Annie.
Yes, thank you, Marc, for this talk. In a way, your story is just the opposite to Don Mackenzie's theory of the performativity of financial economics on the production of prices and working of the market institutions. How do those two theses work together?
I think that's a very beautiful example of how the growth of knowledge and growth of economic, or how economic development moves on. But how special is it? I mean, let's make comparisons. Some of us interpret parallelism as the period in which the semantics of economics arise. That is, in order to be able to tax people, you have to have a notion of income, or there is the growth of the insurance systems, or you can go even much further back in time and speak about the origin of the monetary economy, which requires those who make the coins to have some knowledge as to how to avoid to produce too many. So even if you do not have any written records of what masters of mint in antiquity knew, we can infer they must have had some knowledge.
think maybe you can answer
Okay.
this first two.
Yeah. At a certain level, I could give the same answer to those questions. I think that what I'm trying to bring is in fact a finer, more micro level in the analysis. So why does that matter for both questions? Well, first, because in effect, there's nothing that's strictly speaking incompatible with the to make pledges and things like that. So in fact, there's a connection between performativity and market power. That's fundamental. Now, in practice, as we know, performativity has a story of the Black-Scholes formula, which then guided pricing, and then not so much. Teaches us there's an extent to which actually performativity doesn't work so well empirically. So there's things that happen, difficulties on the road, etc., etc. And then at the end of the day, you need a richer framework to analyze what's going on. So the difference is that I'm not a sociologist, I'm an economist 100%, and I'm trying to use the tools of industrial economics to make sense of those features of production of knowledge. So that's the short answer to what is actually a very good question. On the other question that was asked, actually there's a way in which this very story is an illustration of what we were having in mind, because if you look at the existing literature on how people were doing the computations to extract yields, etc., in the 19th century, you read that actually people had no idea whatsoever, that's the theory out there, had no idea how these things could be calculated. Okay. And so usually when you see people discussing those things, they sort of make assumptions that suppose that contemporaries were very naive or very incompetent, and that they would use their imagination to build that. What that story suggests is that, and that's in line with what you were saying, is that there's a lot of knowledge out there, but to understand how it is played out in the market, you need to take a more focused, look at a more micro level. You really need to put yourself at the level of the very institution you're analyzing. You cannot look at money in general. You have to look at the given monetary system at the given need. You cannot look at finance in general. You have to look at the London Stock Exchange as it is in its 19th century, early 19th century information. Once you do that, you start seeing more precisely what is the knowledge that people mobilize, what is the information they have, what are the difficulties that they have. Following on the same line, and there will be a lot of things to say on the same story, but one thing that you do see, for instance, is that once they have solved a certain type of problem, you see that the originators of new financial products that want to secure a broad market for the issues are going to structure the product in the shape that has been resolved. Because these products will be understandable. Right? And then on the margin of that, you have experimenters that will try different forms, and they may be dealing with a more sophisticated public. We know that sophisticated investors were typically using sophisticated leaders of the Institute of Actuaries at their hand doing computation for them. The origins of option pricing goes back to the work of Lefebvre, who was working for Rothschild in Paris. So people then can acquire more sophisticated forms of knowledge depending on how much money they have and they can put in the process. But by and large, what I'm trying to say here is that my suggestion is, from a methodological point of view, is that we should look at the process that we look at in order to inform our understanding of ideas at a more micro level. What we need more are micro histories, not macro histories. And that's why I kept saying the stock exchange, the London Stock Exchange instead of capital market. I mean a very specific institution. I mean the institution which Ricardo and David, who was one of the pioneers of those computations, put together in the early 1800s.
Yeah, I think we can take 2 or 3 more questions.
No, I'm wondering if this is there is a much more general aspect of this. I think without criminals, we do not need a criminal law. We do not need a criminal sociology. So the criminals actually are the author of criminal law in a sense. And similarly, we can say that without the birds, nobody would have thought that it is possible to project airplanes and so on. I mean, so actually this is tremendously general. I mean, this fact. I mean, of course, in the past, people supposed that disease were sent by gods, and now we have a different attitude. I mean. And I mean, this is just a problem of knowledge.
Yes, thanks a lot for the presentation. About these lotteries, did you have a look at lotteries outside of the stock exchange as well? So what I saw, for example, in Switzerland or Germany, that at that time, a little bit later in the 1890s, they start to prohibit lotteries outside. So this is really then yeah, maybe a knowledge that was suppressed as in opposition to stock exchange lottery knowledge.
Yes, I've been looking at the Mississippi bubble in 1720 and the way in which people made money out of it. And it's interesting to see that Richard Cantillon used his economic theory to analyze what was happening. So it was a type of rational expectation that he formed, that you couldn't have a system in which you attempted to reduce the interest rate, expand the money supply, and revalue the exchange rate, that the three things were incompatible. And he kept quiet about this, but he made a very substantial fortune by speculating against the French currency, by speculating against the French stocks. The interesting thing is that then he sort of tried to rationalize it at a later stage by saying, what has happened? What happened there? Why did law get it so wrong? And he built up a more formal model, which he eventually published as his essay on the nature of trade in general. So I think you can have a lot of these operators who are not rushing out to the market and shouting, hey, I've discovered the new way in which to price stocks. They keep quiet about it. They make their fortunes. In some cases, they may write retrospectively about it. In many cases, I suspect they take the secrets to the grave with them. So I think there are probably a lot of these rational formula that some people worked out and made money on, and which were never actually revealed by the practitioners in case.
Thank you. You put your emphasis, on, as far as I understood, on the relationship between the institutional, the way institutions were addressing crucial questions and the formation of knowledge. Now, to me, there is, in a sense, a more general lesson in what you have in what you have told us, in the message that you are giving. That is that the markets in their working are very complex institutional organizations. And so that, in a sense, the very idea of a market, without looking at these institutional details and the way the market institutions work and happen to build their working practice and their working knowledge, are very abstract ideas. So in my opinion, at least, I don't know if you agree, but there is a strong lesson in this direction, which drives us quite far away from, I don't know, a simplified idea of market as tâtonnement processes or things like that. Thanks.
So my question is, it's why you chose rational expectations as a way of framing your analysis. And because we see people using mathematical expectation here, which is perhaps not so close to rational expectations, and using expectations, mathematical expectations, and averaging would be, for me, a more interesting way of placing these ideas at the time. But so my question is why you chose rational expectations.
In the you hear? In the question of the role that fraud plays in the process, strictly speaking, I have never said that there was fraud. I've even sounded a little ironical, you know, in the way you would have a crash and then you would have a parliamentary investigation and they would find criminals, right? So the way I think of that is more the following. There is this anxiety in the market, and a monopoly, the Institute of Actuaries, jumps into this breach. It's a wonderful opportunity to impose a norm on the back of the anxiety, right? I've been actually looking at some of the data available for that specific crash and the charges that were made in the, you know, in the media and during that parliamentary investigation. It's not clear they really hold. As many cases when you have a crash of that kind, you know, we have people who have been taking risks and it ended badly, and so people complain. So the point I'm rather trying to make here is to say that, again, it's the anxiety of exchange which combines itself with the search for a tool to resolve the anxiety. And the tool to resolve the anxiety is a machine that produces truth. And that machine tends to be a monopoly. That's more like the set of conjectures that we're trying to put together. The lotteries, in Britain as well, the lotteries as such were forbidden at that point. Lotteries in the sense of winning something on top of being reimbursed. The lottery features that they have there is just they use a lottery machine to draw randomly bonds. It's not the same as the feature that existed in some cases where you would win a big prize of £1,000 on top, or 1,000 marks on top of being paid back. Okay. Now it's interesting to think indeed of this instrument are actually pricing technologies, and they were in fact the site of financial innovations. So the one you have in mind and the one I've described, which were lotteries in any case, led to actually the development of insurance products. So you could purchase over the counter an insurance against being reimbursed. Okay, and actually that was a road that they tried to explore before they got to trying to define what the price was. They tried to have the market telling them what the price was. On the Mississippi bubble and expert knowledge in speculation, I agree with everything that you said. Where what I'm trying to say departs a little bit is that I am interested in the production of collective knowledge. Right? So if you have someone who designs some technique, and that technique may have been useful, you suggest it was, we don't know in fact. Maybe he was tremendously lucky, he wrote some stupid equations, but it turned out to work. Or maybe that was actually the reason why he was successful, we don't know. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I'm interested in the manner in which these individual experimentations are suddenly transformed into collective knowledge. And what is happening, the reason why I think it's important is that somehow this is an explanation of the rise of financial economics at that moment. people like Valras were connected to the actuaries, to the French actuaries, for instance, and other people who pioneered mathematical economics back in those years are connected to that. But the change that is taking place, which I think is fundamental, is that we know that, I mean, you mentioned Cantillon, Necker, when he was doing his life insurance product on young women from Geneva, etc., was using the services of mathematicians, and we're trying to beat the market by having more educated formula. And it would be fantastic to the extent that we would have documentation for all to be able to describe that story, okay? But that's a different story from the one I'm trying to narrate. The one I'm trying to narrate is, again, the emergence of norms that suddenly start popping up and appearing on the market, and that seem to be tremendously important. And they have to do with, in fact, those anxieties which are much more tied with the uninformed investor. It's a story of information asymmetry. The Cantillon or Necker, they're insiders. So they use math as insiders. So the modality of using mathematics that emerges with those institutions is a very different one, I feel. And it has to do with the rise of investment by the middle class, which changes the modality of knowledge at that moment. So that's not something I had really time to develop further. But that's the reason why I think that there's a difference between this localized expert knowledge and the moment when the thing becomes institutionalized. I think the process of institutionalization per se is very interesting. Very brief. Okay, so institutions, yes. Semantics, yes.